I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work, staring at the clock after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. In the towering glass monuments of downtown Chicago, where Lake Michigan's icy winds carved stories into the faces of those who dared to walk its streets, Rosa Martinez had learned that invisibility was both a curse and a blessing. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of scrubbing floors and folding other people's clothes, moved with the precision of a surgeon as she polished the mahogany banister of the Carrington mansion. The silence in this penthouse was so complete it felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of her own neighborhood on the south side, where children's laughter mixed with the aroma of tamales and the rumble of the elevated train that carried dreams and disappointments in equal measure. Robert Carrington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, watching the city below without really seeing it. At 58, he possessed everything the American dream promised: a fortune built on shrewd stock market investments, properties scattered across 3 states, and enough wealth stored in various portfolios, including cryptocurrency and gold reserves, to sustain generations. Yet the numbers on his bank statements felt as cold as the marble floors Rosa cleaned each morning. 2 years had passed since Margaret's funeral, and the mansion still echoed with her absence. His teenage children, Jessica and Michael, had become strangers living under his roof, their hearts hardened by privilege and softened by nothing. The morning Rosa first walked through those imposing oak doors, Chicago was buried under 6 inches of fresh snow. She had risen at 4:30, as she did every weekday, brewing coffee in the tiny kitchen of her studio apartment on South Halsted Street. The radiator clanked its familiar protest against the cold, and through the thin walls she could hear Mrs. Gonzalez coughing, a sound that had grown more frequent and more concerning over the past months. Rosa's reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a woman of 45 who looked older, not from vanity lost, but from battles fought quietly, victories won in silence, and sorrows carried with dignity. The 2-hour commute to the Gold Coast involved 3 bus transfers, each bringing her closer to a world that existed in stark contrast to her own. She pressed her face against the fogged window of the final bus, watching as the landscape transformed from corner stores with hand-painted signs advertising "Se habla español" and check cashing, to pristine sidewalks lined with boutiques where a single handbag cost more than her monthly rent. Her thick winter coat, a donation from the church thrift store, had seen better decades, but it kept her warm, and warmth was a luxury she never took for granted. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had managed the Carrington household for 15 years, greeted Rosa with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "You'll be handling the main floors," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had climbed the invisible hierarchy of service. "Mr. Carrington expects perfection, not effort. The previous girl thought she could take shortcuts." The dismissal in her tone was clear. Rosa was already being measured against someone else's failure. The mansion was a monument to wealth accumulated through generations of strategic investments and business acquisitions. Crystal chandeliers imported from Austria cast rainbows across walls adorned with original paintings whose value exceeded the GDP of small nations. Robert's grandfather had started with a single steel mill during the post-war boom. His father had diversified into real estate and technology stocks. Robert himself had multiplied the family fortune through carefully timed market moves, including an early investment in Bitcoin that had paid dividends beyond his wildest projections. Every surface Rosa touched represented money: floors of imported Italian marble, fixtures of solid gold, furniture handcrafted by artisans whose names appeared in design magazines. Yet for all its opulence, the house felt abandoned. Dust gathered in corners that expensive cleaning services had somehow missed. The kitchen, despite being equipped with appliances worth more than most people's cars, showed signs of disuse. Takeout containers hidden in trash cans, expensive wine opened but barely touched, a dining room table that seated 12 but hadn't hosted a family meal in months. Rose's first encounter with the Carrington children revealed the casual cruelty that privilege could breed. Jessica, 17 and beautiful in the way that money could enhance natural gifts, looked through Rosa as if she were part of the furniture. "Great. Another one," she muttered to her friend Madison, who was visiting for the weekend. "Daddy goes through maids like he goes through stock portfolios." Michael, 15 and already showing signs of his father's aloofness, simply ignored Rosa's presence entirely, his attention focused on the latest iPhone that had cost more than Rosa's yearly medical insurance. But it was Robert himself who delivered the coldest reception. He stood in his study, surrounded by monitors displaying real-time market data, cryptocurrency fluctuations, and international monetary exchanges, barely glancing up when Mrs. Henderson introduced Rosa. His greeting was a dismissive nod, his instructions delivered in the clipped tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The house requires intensive maintenance. I trust you understand the expectations." No warmth, no acknowledgement of her humanity. She was simply another asset in his inventory, as replaceable as any stock in his diverse portfolio. The other staff members, a cook who came twice weekly, a gardener who maintained the rooftop terrace, and 2 part-time assistants, had formed their own ecosystem of gossip and judgment. They watched Rosa with the suspicion reserved for outsiders, whispering among themselves about her worn clothing and accented English, making assumptions about her background and her place in their carefully constructed hierarchy. During lunch breaks, they clustered together in the servants' kitchen, their conversations falling silent whenever Rosa appeared. But Rosa had survived worse than the cold shoulders of distant employers and resentful co-workers. Her strength had been forged in the fires of real hardship, raising her younger siblings after their parents' divorce, working multiple jobs to put herself through community college, sending money to Mexico when her grandmother became ill, and later caring for her own parents as they aged and their health declined. Each morning, she tied her graying hair back with a rubber band that had seen better days, put on the uniform dress that Mrs. Henderson had provided, and began her work with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge life had presented. The mansion's rooms were vast and impersonal, filled with furniture that looked expensive but felt unwelcoming. Rosa's trained eye noticed details that others missed. The way natural light fell across the hardwood floors revealed scratches from furniture that had been moved carelessly, water stains on expensive wood surfaces where glasses had been left without coasters, and the subtle signs of a household running on autopilot rather than love. As she worked, she hummed softly, songs her mother had taught her, melodies that spoke of resilience and hope, filling the empty spaces with the only warmth the house had known in months. The rhythm of her days became predictable. Arrive before dawn, clean until evening, return home exhausted, but with enough dignity and tact to face another day. Her small apartment might have been modest, but it was hers, filled with photographs of family, a crucifix that had belonged to her grandmother, and the scent of candles lit in prayer for those she loved. The contrast between the 2 worlds she inhabited daily was stark, one cold and impressive, the other warm and real. Yet she moved between them with grace, never allowing the coldness of wealth to freeze the warmth in her heart, never letting the dismissiveness of those she served diminish her sense of self-worth. In those first weeks, Rosa learned to read the invisible currents of the Carrington household, understanding which rooms Robert preferred undisturbed, which corners Jessica used for private phone calls with boyfriends, and which times of day Michael was most likely to emerge from his room to grab food from the kitchen. She adapted to their rhythms while maintaining her own, a quiet presence that asked for nothing more than the opportunity to do her work with dignity and receive the respect that every human being deserved. The weeks that followed Rosa's arrival at the Carrington mansion unfolded like pages in a book written in silence and endurance. Chicago's brutal winter showed no mercy, and each morning brought new challenges that tested even Rosa's remarkable resilience. The city's wind howled through the canyons created by towering skyscrapers, carrying with it the scent of snow and exhaust fumes, while Rosa made her daily pilgrimage from the warmth of community on the south side to the cold perfection of the Gold Coast. Her alarm clock, a relic from the 1980s that had somehow survived multiple moves and countless early mornings, buzzed at 4:15 each day without fail. Rosa's small apartment on South Halsted Street occupied the second floor of a 3-story building that housed 6 families, all of them connected by the shared experience of working multiple jobs to make ends meet. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mr. Rodriguez preparing for his shift at the steel mill, the sound of his work boots echoing in the hallway, and Mrs. Fernandez singing lullabies to her infant grandson who had colic and cried through most nights. Rosa's morning routine was a meditation in efficiency born from necessity. She heated water for coffee on a stove that required coaxing to maintain consistent flame, dressed in layers that would protect her from both the cold wind and the judgment she faced daily, and packed a lunch that cost less than what the Carrington family spent on a single appetizer at their favorite downtown restaurant. The brown bag contained leftovers from her simple dinners, beans and rice, sometimes a piece of chicken breast purchased on sale, always accompanied by fruit that she bought from the vendor who set up his cart near the bus stop and who remembered her name and asked about her family. The commute itself was a journey through the economic geography of Chicago. The first bus carried mostly service workers like herself, hospital orderlies heading to early shifts, cleaning ladies bound for office buildings downtown, security guards whose night shifts were ending as her day began. Their faces told stories of quiet sacrifice, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Rosa found comfort in their silent companionship, in the shared understanding that they were the invisible workforce that kept the city functioning. The second bus introduced a different demographic: office workers, teachers, social workers whose clothing was slightly better, whose conversations revealed college educations and aspirations that had been at least partially fulfilled. Rosa listened to their discussions about weekend plans, about children's soccer games and school performances, about small victories and everyday concerns that seemed both familiar and distant from her own reality. The final bus carried her into the rarefied atmosphere of wealth, where the passengers were predominantly domestic workers like herself, nannies, housekeepers, gardeners, personal assistants who served the wealthy but lived worlds away from the luxury they maintained. The conversation on this bus was often in Spanish or Polish, languages of hard work and determination, punctuated by stories of employers who ranged from kind to indifferent to quietly cruel. Rosa's relationship with Mrs. Henderson remained formally polite but cold. The head housekeeper, a black woman in her early 60s who had worked for wealthy families since she was 17, had developed a protective shell that allowed her to navigate the complex dynamics of service in America. She had seen dozens of employees come and go, had witnessed the casual racism and classism that wealth could enable, and had survived by maintaining strict boundaries and never allowing herself to expect more than professional courtesy from those she served. Her attitude toward Rosa was influenced by this hard-won wisdom. Kindness was a luxury that could be withdrawn without notice, so it was safer to maintain distance. The mansion's daily rhythms were dictated by Robert's schedule, which revolved around global markets that never slept. Rosa learned that his wealth was not merely inherited, but actively managed through a complex portfolio that included technology stocks, real estate investments across 3 continents, precious metals stored in secure facilities, and a substantial position in cryptocurrency that fluctuated wildly but generally trended upward. His home office was filled with multiple monitors displaying real-time financial data from Tokyo to London to New York, and Rosa quickly learned that certain hours were absolutely sacred. No cleaning, no interruption, no acknowledgement of her existence, as Robert made decisions involving millions of dollars with the same casual attention most people reserved for choosing breakfast cereal. Jessica Carrington embodied the particular brand of cruelty that could emerge from a life without consequences. At 17, she possessed her mother's beauty enhanced by the kind of professional care that money could buy. Perfect teeth straightened by top orthodontists, flawless skin maintained by dermatologists who charged more for a single visit than Rosa earned in a week, and a wardrobe that represented more money than many families saw in a year. Her treatment of Rosa was not driven by personal animosity, but by a worldview that classified people into categories of worthy and unworthy of her attention. The incident with the wine glass became a defining moment in Rosa's early weeks at the mansion. Jessica had been entertaining friends in the formal living room, teenagers whose casual conversation revealed lives of extraordinary privilege, ski trips to Aspen, summer homes in the Hamptons, college plans that were assured by family connections rather than academic merit. Rosa was cleaning the adjacent dining room when she heard the sharp sound of crystal breaking, followed by Jessica's imperious voice calling, "Rosa, there's been an accident." The red wine stain on the antique Persian rug was substantial, the kind of damage that would require professional restoration. Jessica stood over it with feigned concern, her friends watching with the detached interest of spectators at a mildly entertaining performance. "I don't know how this happened," Jessica announced, though Rosa had heard the laughter and commotion that preceded the crash. "You'll need to fix this immediately." Rosa knelt beside the stain, her experienced hands already assessing the damage. The rug was worth more than her annual salary. She knew this not because anyone had told her, but because her years of cleaning wealthy homes had taught her to recognize true luxury. She worked quietly and efficiently, using techniques learned through trial and error in dozens of similar situations, while Jessica provided a running commentary for her friends about the difficulty of finding reliable help. "Daddy went through 3 housekeepers last year," Jessica confided in a voice loud enough for Rosa to hear. "They always promise they can handle the responsibility, but then something like this happens." The implication was clear. Rosa was already being blamed for an accident she hadn't caused, her competence questioned before she had a fair chance to prove herself. But Rosa's response was not what Jessica expected. She continued working without protest, without excuses, without the defensive anger that might have been justified. Her silence was more powerful than any argument, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. When she finished, the stain was nearly invisible, and the rug looked better than it had in months. She packed her supplies without a word and continued with her other duties, leaving Jessica and her friends to fill the silence with increasingly uncomfortable conversation. Michael Carrington presented a different challenge. At 15, he was already showing signs of the emotional withdrawal that characterized his father, but his youth made his pain more visible. He spent most of his time in his bedroom, emerging only for meals that were eaten in silence at a table large enough to accommodate a dozen people, but which felt empty with just 3 family members occupying its expanse. Rosa observed him during these rare appearances, noting the way his shoulders carried tension that seemed too heavy for someone his age, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with his father, the way he pushed food around his plate without really eating. His room was a contradiction, expensive electronics and designer clothes scattered among the detritus of adolescent depression. Empty pizza boxes hidden under the bed suggested meals eaten in isolation, while prescription bottles on his nightstand revealed anxiety and sleep disorders that money couldn't cure. Rosa cleaned around these intimate details of his life with the same discretion she brought to all her work, never commenting, never judging, simply maintaining order in spaces that reflected the disorder of hearts struggling to find their way. The other staff members gradually revealed their own stories and motivations. Elena, the part-time cook who prepared elaborate meals that were often left half-eaten, had immigrated from El Salvador 20 years earlier and supported not only her own family, but also relatives back home who depended on her remittances. Her attitude toward Rosa was cautious but not unkind. She recognized a fellow survivor and extended the small courtesies that made their shared invisibility more bearable. Carlos, the gardener who maintained the mansion's rooftop terrace and outdoor spaces, spoke little English but communicated through the universal language of hard work and mutual respect. He had noticed Rosa's careful handling of the plants inside the house, the way she adjusted blinds to ensure optimal light for the expensive orchids and exotic flowers that decorated the main rooms, and he began leaving small tokens of appreciation: a perfect flower from the greenhouse, a piece of fruit from the kitchen, in places where only Rosa would find them. Mrs. Henderson's cold efficiency masked a more complex relationship with the household. She had been Margaret Carrington's personal choice, hired during happier times when the mansion had hosted dinner parties and charity events, when laughter echoed through rooms that now stood empty and formal. Margaret's death had left Mrs. Henderson in an uncertain position, too invested to leave easily, too proud to acknowledge how much the family's dysfunction affected her own sense of purpose. Her treatment of Rosa was colored by grief and fear, emotions that she couldn't afford to show but couldn't entirely suppress. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the emotional state of its occupants. Despite the impressive art collection, paintings by recognized masters whose value appreciated even as the family struggled to find meaning in their shared space, the walls felt cold and unwelcoming. The formal dining room, with its table that could seat 16 guests, hadn't hosted a dinner party since Margaret's death. The library, lined with leather-bound books that had never been opened, served as a monument to intellectual pretension rather than genuine learning. The music room, with its baby grand piano that had cost more than most people's cars, stood silent and dusty, its bench empty of the musician it had been purchased to inspire. Rosa's response to this environment was neither judgment nor pity, but something more complex and ultimately more powerful. She began to practice a form of quiet ministry that transformed spaces through simple presence and genuine care. When she cleaned the library, she opened windows to let in fresh air and arranged the books so that their spines caught the light better. When she dusted the piano, she hummed the melodies her grandmother had taught her, filling the silence with warmth that the expensive instrument had never provided. When she cleaned the family photographs that lined the hallway, she handled them with the reverence reserved for sacred objects, understanding that these images represented a love that had been lost but not forgotten. Her work became a form of prayer, each task performed with attention that went beyond mere duty. She understood that she was not simply cleaning surfaces, but tending to a household that had forgotten how to nurture itself, caring for a family that had lost its way in the maze of wealth and privilege that was supposed to provide happiness, but had instead created isolation and pain. The first breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late February, when Chicago was experiencing one of its periodic deep freezes that made even short trips outdoors dangerous. The mansion's heating system, despite its expensive installation and regular maintenance, had developed problems that left certain areas of the house uncomfortably cold. Robert had called for repairs, but the earliest appointment was 2 days away, and the family was facing the unusual experience of being cold in their own home. Rosa noticed that Michael had developed a persistent cough, the kind of deep rattling sound that suggested his condition was worsening rather than improving. She had seen similar symptoms in her own neighborhood, where inadequate heating and poor insulation made winter illnesses common and sometimes dangerous. While Mrs. Henderson focused on calling the heating contractor and expressing her displeasure at the delay, Rosa took practical action that came from years of managing household crises without resources or professional help. In the servants' kitchen, using ingredients from the expensive but underutilized pantry, Rosa prepared a pot of chicken soup that filled the entire wing of the mansion with aromas that spoke of comfort and care. She had learned the recipe from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother, a chain of knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that healing sometimes began with nourishment that was prepared with love rather than purchased with money. The soup was more than a meal. It was a demonstration of competence that had nothing to do with expensive appliances or gourmet ingredients, and everything to do with understanding how to transform basic components into something that could provide comfort and healing. Rosa used the Carrington's state-of-the-art kitchen equipment with the same efficiency she brought to her own modest cooking space, proving that skills mattered more than tools, that knowledge was more valuable than expensive gadgets. When Michael emerged from his room, drawn by the unfamiliar but appealing scent, Rosa served him a bowl and insisted he eat it while it was still hot. She wrapped him in the cashmere throw from the living room, a gesture that was both practical and symbolic, using the family's luxury items for actual comfort rather than display. Then, in a voice soft with years of singing lullabies to children who weren't her own, she began to hum. The melody was one that her grandmother had hummed while caring for Rosa during her own childhood illnesses, a song without words that spoke directly to the part of the human heart that longed for comfort and safety. Michael, who hadn't been sung to sleep since his mother's death, found himself relaxing for the first time in months, his cough gradually subsiding as the combination of warm soup and genuine care worked its healing magic. Robert, returning from his office to check on the heating situation, found them in the kitchen, his son eating with an appetite that had been absent for weeks, this quiet woman he barely noticed providing the kind of care that no amount of money could purchase. The scene stopped him at the doorway, reminding him of memories he had carefully buried, of times when his home had been filled with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with thermostats and everything to do with love expressed through simple actions. In that moment, Rosa looked up and met his gaze directly for the first time since her employment began. Her eyes held no challenge, no request for recognition, but they carried a depth of compassion that pierced through the emotional armor he had constructed since Margaret's death. She nodded slightly, a gesture that acknowledged his presence without interrupting the care she was providing to his son, and then returned her attention to Michael, with the same focused attention she brought to every task. The impact of this scene extended far beyond the immediate comfort it provided. Michael's improvement was dramatic and sustained. His cough disappeared, his appetite returned, and for the first time in months, he emerged from his room voluntarily to join the family for meals. Jessica, who had observed the entire incident from the hallway, found herself curious about this unremarkable woman who had accomplished something that doctors and therapists had failed to achieve. But the most significant change was in Robert himself. The sight of his son being cared for with such gentle competence had awakened memories he had worked hard to suppress, memories of Margaret's hands smoothing his forehead during illness, of the way she had hummed while cooking, of the countless small acts of love that had made their house a home, rather than simply a showcase for wealth. For the first time since her death, he found himself wondering whether he had been so focused on maintaining their lifestyle that he had forgotten to maintain their life together. Rosa continued her work as if nothing had changed, but something fundamental had shifted in the household's dynamics. Her presence, which had previously been tolerated as a necessary inconvenience, began to be quietly appreciated as rooms became more comfortable. Meals appeared when they were needed, and small problems were solved before they became major disruptions. She had demonstrated that competence and caring were not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths that could transform even the most challenging environments. The mansion's atmosphere didn't change overnight, but like a ship slowly changing course, it began to turn toward a different destination, one where wealth and warmth might coexist, where privilege could be balanced with gratitude, and where the invisible work of caring for others might finally be seen and valued for what it truly was, the foundation upon which all other accomplishments rested. As winter grudgingly gave way to spring in Chicago, Rosa had been working for the Carrington family for nearly 6 months. Lake Michigan began to shed its icy armor, and the first brave crocuses pushed through the snow in Grant Park, their purple faces defying the lingering cold. The city itself seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath against the brutal weather, and even the mansion's sterile atmosphere showed subtle signs of transformation that paralleled the seasonal change outside. Rosa had established routines that went beyond mere cleaning, developing an intuitive understanding of the household's unspoken needs. She arrived each morning with the reliability of sunrise, her presence becoming as expected and essential as electricity or running water. The family had grown accustomed to her quiet competence, to rooms that maintained perfect order without apparent effort, to problems that were solved before they were even noticed. Yet Rosa remained largely invisible to them, a paradox of indispensability and anonymity that she navigated with the same grace she brought to all aspects of her work. Her own life beyond the mansion continued to demand sacrifices that would have overwhelmed someone with less resilience. Each evening, after completing her duties for the Carringtons, Rosa returned to an apartment building where every resident seemed to face challenges that required her attention. Mrs. Gonzalez's cough had developed into chronic bronchitis that left her weak and frightened, unable to work the cleaning jobs that provided her only income. Rosa had quietly begun contributing to her medical expenses, sharing her own carefully budgeted resources with someone whose need was greater than her own. The Rodriguez family was struggling with their oldest son's arrest on immigration charges, a situation that had transformed their usually cheerful apartment into a place of whispered conversations and constant anxiety. Rosa had connected them with a legal aid organization through her church, accompanying Mrs. Rodriguez to appointments when her English proved inadequate for the complex legal terminology that would determine her family's future. These acts of kindness were never performed for recognition. They were simply expressions of Rosa's fundamental belief that people were responsible for caring for each other, especially during times when institutional support proved insufficient or unavailable. Her own parents, living in a small house on the far south side that Rosa visited every Sunday after church, represented her greatest source of both motivation and worry. Her father, Eduardo, had worked for 40 years in a series of manufacturing jobs that had provided steady income, but no pension, no health insurance that extended into retirement, and no protection against the economic upheavals that had closed most of Chicago's remaining factories. At 72, he faced each day with the stoicism of someone who had learned not to expect mercy from a world that valued productivity over humanity. Her mother, Carmen, had developed arthritis so severe that simple tasks like opening jars or buttoning clothing had become exercises in endurance. The medication that could ease her pain cost more than their Social Security provided, creating impossible choices between comfort and other necessities. Rosa's weekly contribution to their household, money carefully saved from her wages despite her own modest needs, made the difference between basic survival and something approaching dignity in their final years. During these Sunday visits, Rosa never mentioned the wealth she encountered daily at the Carrington mansion. She didn't describe the casual waste she witnessed, food that was discarded barely touched, clothing worn once and forgotten, appliances replaced not because they were broken, but because newer models offered marginal improvements. Instead, she focused on the small pleasures that money couldn't provide: the satisfaction of a job well done, the comfort of family meals shared around a table that wobbled but was surrounded by love, the peace that came from faith sustained despite circumstances that might have justified bitterness. Back at the mansion, Rosa began to notice changes in the family members that she attributed to the subtle improvements in their environment rather than any conscious effort on their part to treat her differently. Michael had begun leaving his room more frequently, drawn by the appealing aromas that now emanated from the kitchen, where Rosa sometimes prepared simple snacks that reminded him of childhood comforts he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. His appetite had improved dramatically, and with it, his energy and engagement with the world around him. More surprisingly, he'd begun attempting conversations with Rosa that went beyond simple greetings. His initial questions were tentative, asking about the music she hummed while working, commenting on the way certain flowers seemed to thrive better since she had begun caring for them. These interactions revealed a young man who was struggling to find his place in a world that had given him everything except the emotional security that would have allowed him to appreciate his advantages. Jessica's transformation was more complex and initially more resistant. At 17, she possessed enough self-awareness to recognize that her treatment of Rosa had been unnecessarily cruel, but her pride made apologies difficult and her insecurity made genuine connections seem dangerous. However, she had begun to notice details about Rosa's work that had previously escaped her attention. The way Rosa handled her expensive clothing with more care than Jessica herself showed. The subtle improvements in the arrangement of her bedroom that made it more comfortable without being obviously different. The way Rosa never betrayed any judgment about the evidence of Jessica's sometimes reckless behavior. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult week when Jessica had fought with her boyfriend, received disappointing grades on college entrance exams, and endured a series of social complications with friends whose loyalty proved as shallow as their conversations. Rosa found her crying in her bedroom, surrounded by tissues and the detritus of adolescent despair, her carefully maintained image of perfection temporarily abandoned in favor of honest emotional expression. Rosa's response was neither intrusive nor dismissive. She simply continued with her cleaning routine while maintaining a presence that offered comfort without demanding explanation. When Jessica finally looked up, expecting to see judgment or pity, she found instead a face that reflected understanding and acceptance. "Some days are harder than others," Rosa said quietly, her accented English carrying decades of wisdom earned through experience rather than education. "But tomorrow is always different." The simplicity of this statement, coupled with Rosa's obvious sincerity, penetrated Jessica's defensive shell in a way that countless hours of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. For the first time since her mother's death, Jessica found herself crying not just from frustration, but from relief at being seen and accepted without condition or expectation. Rosa handed her a glass of water and a fresh box of tissues, small gestures that somehow conveyed more care than she had experienced in months of expensive professional counseling. Robert's awareness of Rosa's impact on his household developed more gradually, but ultimately more profoundly. His initial observation had focused on obvious improvements. The house ran more smoothly, his children seemed healthier and more engaged, and problems that had previously required his attention were resolved before they reached crisis level. But as weeks passed, he began to notice subtler changes that spoke to Rosa's influence extending beyond simple domestic management. The mansion itself felt different, not warmer in temperature, which was controlled by the same expensive heating system, but warmer in some indefinable way that affected how he felt upon entering each evening. Rooms that had previously felt like museum displays now felt like actual living spaces where people might find comfort and peace. The formal dining room, which hadn't been used for family meals since Margaret's death, had somehow become inviting again, with flowers from the garden arranged in ways that suggested celebration rather than obligation. Most significantly, Robert found himself beginning to remember aspects of his life that had been overshadowed by grief and business obligations. The sight of Rosa humming while she worked reminded him of Margaret's habit of singing during household tasks, transforming mundane chores into moments of joy. The way Rosa handled his children's emotional needs with quiet competence reminded him of his own mother's ability to provide comfort through simple presence and practical care. These memories were not entirely comfortable. They forced Robert to confront how much he had withdrawn from family life after Margaret's death, how completely he had allowed business concerns to fill the space that grief had created in his heart. But they also suggested possibilities he had stopped allowing himself to consider, that his house might become a home again, that his relationship with his children might be rebuilt on foundations stronger than shared financial interests, that he might find ways to honor Margaret's memory through living fully rather than simply surviving successfully. One evening in early April, as Rosa prepared to leave for the day, Robert found himself in the kitchen where she was completing her final tasks. The setting sun through the bay window cast long shadows across surfaces that gleamed with her careful attention, and the air carried hints of the dinner she had prepared. Simple ingredients transformed into something that promised both nourishment and comfort. For the first time since her employment began, he attempted a conversation that went beyond instructions or logistics. "My son seems much better lately," he said, his voice carrying uncertainty about how to navigate unfamiliar territory. "His appetite has improved significantly." Rosa paused in her work, meeting his gaze with the same direct attention she brought to every interaction. "He is a good boy," she replied quietly. Sometimes young people just need to know someone cares about their well-being. The simplicity of her response highlighted the complexity of what she had achieved. Without psychology degrees or expensive interventions, through nothing more than consistent care and attention, she had accomplished what months of professional help had failed to provide. Robert found himself wondering what other simple truths he had overlooked in his focus on complicated solutions to problems that might have yielded to nothing more than patient attention and genuine concern. "I've never properly thanked you," he continued, surprising himself with his vulnerability, "for everything you do here. I know it goes far beyond your job description." Rosa's smile was gentle but not submissive, acknowledging his recognition while maintaining her dignity. "Every family deserves to feel comfortable in their own home," she said. "I am happy to help make that possible." The conversation ended there, but its impact lingered long after Rosa had departed for her evening commute home. Robert remained in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of her work, but more impressed by the evidence of her character. He realized that in his focus on accumulating wealth through strategic stock investments, real estate acquisitions, and diversified portfolios that included everything from precious metals to cryptocurrency, he had somehow lost sight of what wealth was supposed to provide: security, comfort, and the freedom to focus on relationships and experiences that created genuine satisfaction. That night, for the first time since Margaret's death, Robert had dinner with his children in the formal dining room, rather than eating alone in his study while reviewing financial reports. The meal Rosa had prepared was simple but delicious, and the conversation, while tentative, felt more genuine than their exchanges had been in months. Michael asked about his father's work with curiosity rather than resentment, and Jessica shared details about her college applications that revealed both intelligence and ambition that had been hidden beneath her previous sullenness. As spring progressed toward summer, these family dinners became regular occurrences, and Rosa's influence on the household continued to grow in ways that were both subtle and transformative. She never overstepped boundaries or presumed intimacy that hadn't been offered, but her presence had become essential to the family's emotional ecosystem in ways that went far beyond her official duties. The mansion's gardens, under Carlos's expert care, but with Rosa's gentle suggestions about which flowers would be most beautiful visible from the family's favorite rooms, began to bloom with unusual vitality. The interior spaces, arranged with Rosa's intuitive understanding of how environments could affect emotional states, became settings for conversations and connections that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Yet Rosa's own life continued to present challenges that would have overwhelmed someone with less resilience and faith. Her parents' health concerns were ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and financial sacrifice. Her neighborhood faced increasing pressures from gentrification that threatened to displace families who had built community through decades of mutual support and shared struggle. Her own modest savings, accumulated through careful budgeting and self-denial, remained vulnerable to any unexpected crisis that might require significant expenditure. These realities provided constant reminders of the vast gulf between Rosa's world and the world she served each day. But rather than breeding resentment or bitterness, they seemed to strengthen her conviction that every person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their economic circumstances. Her work at the Carrington Mansion was not just employment, but ministry. An opportunity to demonstrate that caring and competence could transform even the most challenging environments if applied with patience, wisdom, and genuine concern for others' well-being. By early summer, Rosa had become indispensable to the Carrington household in ways that extended far beyond her official job description. She was not just cleaning their house, but healing their hearts, not just maintaining their possessions, but restoring their relationships, not just serving their practical needs, but nourishing their souls with the kind of attention and care that money could not purchase, but which made all their wealth meaningful for the first time in years. Summer arrived in Chicago with the kind of dramatic transformation that made the city's brutal winters seem like someone else's memory. Grant Park exploded with green life. Lake Michigan sparkled under brilliant sunshine that coaxed crowds to its shores, and even the most hardened residents found themselves smiling at strangers as they walked streets that had been empty and hostile just months before. The Carrington mansion, perched high above the bustle of Michigan Avenue, seemed to partake in this seasonal rebirth, its rooms brightened by longer days and its atmosphere lightened by changes that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the quiet revolution Rosa had been conducting since February. The transformation was most evident during the family's Sunday dinners, which had evolved from tentative experiments in togetherness to genuine celebrations of their connection. Rosa didn't cook these meals. That remained Elena's domain, but her influence was everywhere. In the fresh flowers from the garden that graced the table, in the way the dining room had been arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal display, in the subtle improvements to lighting and comfort that made the space feel welcoming rather than imposing. Robert found himself looking forward to these gatherings with anticipation he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. His children, previously strangers who shared only his last name and his address, were revealing personalities and perspectives that surprised and delighted him. Michael's interest in environmental science had led to passionate discussions about renewable energy investments, conversations that bridged Robert's business expertise with his son's idealistic concerns about climate change and sustainability. Jessica's college plans were taking shape around international relations, her intelligence finally finding outlets beyond social media drama and teenage rebellion. But the most remarkable change was in the way they treated Rosa. What had begun as indifference or condescension had evolved into genuine respect and affection. Jessica now greeted Rosa warmly each morning, sometimes sharing details about her day or asking for advice about problems that she wouldn't have discussed with expensive counselors. Michael had begun helping Rosa with tasks that were officially beyond his responsibilities, carrying heavy items or assisting with organizational projects that required more than one person's attention. Robert's own relationship with Rosa had developed into something unprecedented in his experience with household employees. She remained professional and respectful, never presuming familiarities that hadn't been explicitly invited, but their interactions had gained depth and meaning that enriched both their lives. He found himself seeking her opinions on matters that extended beyond household management, her observations about his children's emotional needs, her insights into family dynamics that his business training hadn't prepared him to navigate, her simple wisdom about what truly mattered in creating a life worth living. These conversations often occurred in the kitchen during Rosa's final tasks of the day, natural exchanges that arose from shared concerns rather than formal meetings. Rosa's perspective, informed by years of caring for others and managing limited resources, provided counterpoint to Robert's worldview, shaped by abundance and corporate strategy. She helped him understand that his children's recent improvements weren't the result of expensive interventions or professional counseling, but simply a response to feeling genuinely cared for and valued by the adults in their lives. Children are like plants, Rosa explained one evening as she arranged flowers in a vase, her hands gentle and sure despite their roughness from years of hard work. They need attention and stability more than expensive fertilizer. When they know someone is watching them with love, they naturally want to grow toward the light. Her wisdom extended beyond child-rearing to broader questions about purpose and meaning that Robert had been avoiding since Margaret's death. Through subtle comments and patient listening, Rosa helped him recognize that his obsession with financial success had become a form of emotional avoidance, a way of staying busy enough to avoid confronting grief and loneliness that no amount of money could resolve. "Wealth is like a tool," she observed during one of their evening conversations. "Very useful for building things, but only if you know what you want to build. Without a plan, even the best tools just create expensive messes." These insights prompted Robert to examine his life with honesty that was both painful and liberating. His investment portfolio, diversified across stocks, bonds, real estate, precious metals, and cryptocurrency, had continued growing even as his satisfaction with life had diminished. His net worth, measured in millions of dollars in valuable assets, had reached levels that exceeded his grandparents' wildest dreams of prosperity. Yet he felt poorer in ways that mattered most than he had as a young man, with more debts than assets, but clear goals and loving relationships. Rosa's influence extended beyond psychological counseling to practical improvements that enhanced the household's daily operations. Her organizational skills, developed through managing multiple responsibilities on severely limited resources, brought efficiency to systems that had been wastefully complex. She streamlined shopping procedures, eliminated redundant services, and negotiated better arrangements with suppliers, changes that saved money while improving results. More importantly, she had transformed the mansion's atmosphere through countless small improvements that demonstrated how attention to detail could create emotional comfort that expensive decorating couldn't achieve. Furniture was rearranged to promote conversation and connection rather than formal display. Lighting was adjusted to minimize harsh shadows and maximize warmth. Flowers and plants were positioned to bring natural beauty into spaces that had previously felt sterile despite their valuable art and antique furnishings. The household staff, initially suspicious of Rosa's competence and popularity with the family, had gradually come to respect and rely on her judgment. Mrs. Cunt Henderson's relationship with Rosa had evolved from chilly professionalism to genuine collaboration, as both women recognized their shared commitment to maintaining standards that went beyond mere cleanliness to encompass genuine care for the family's well-being. Elena, the part-time cook, had begun consulting with Rosa about menu planning and family preferences, appreciating her insights into nutrition and comfort foods that could address emotional needs as well as physical hunger. Carlos, the gardener, worked with Rosa to coordinate outdoor and indoor spaces so that the mansion's beauty flowed seamlessly from garden to interior rooms, creating unified environments that supported relaxation and connection. But Rosa's own life continued to present challenges that highlighted the persistent inequalities that shaped American society despite decades of legal and social progress. Her parents' health problems required constant vigilance and financial sacrifice that strained her modest budget. Her father's diabetes had progressed to the point where he needed expensive medication and regular medical monitoring that Medicare covered inadequately. Her mother's arthritis had worsened to the point where simple tasks like cooking and cleaning had become exercises in pain management that broke Rosa's heart to witness. The neighborhood where Rosa lived was experiencing rapid gentrification that threatened to displace families who had built community through decades of mutual support and shared struggle. Property values were rising faster than incomes, and longtime residents faced impossible choices between accepting buyouts that seemed generous but wouldn't provide comparable housing elsewhere, or struggling to pay increased taxes and utility costs that strained budgets already stretched to their limits. Rosa's own apartment building was sold to developers who announced plans for extensive renovations that would require all current residents to relocate temporarily, with no guarantee that they would be able to afford returning once improvements were completed. The stress of potential displacement, combined with her parents' deteriorating health and her own long hours working for the Carringtons, created pressure that would have overwhelmed someone with less resilience and faith. Yet, Rosa continued her work with the same dedication and grace that had characterized her service from the beginning. She never allowed her personal struggles to affect the quality of her work or her relationships with the family, maintaining professional standards that exceeded what her modest salary would have demanded from someone with less integrity and commitment to excellence. Her strength came from sources that had nothing to do with material wealth or social position, from faith developed through years of relying on spiritual resources when practical options were limited, from community connections that provided emotional support even when financial assistance was impossible, from family relationships that emphasized love and loyalty over individual advancement or material success. These values, invisible to casual observers but fundamental to Rosa's character, were what enabled her to transform the Carrington household despite facing challenges in her personal life that would have justified bitterness, resentment, or simply giving up. Her example demonstrated that dignity and grace were not privileges reserved for the wealthy, but qualities that could be cultivated and maintained regardless of economic circumstances, qualities that were, in fact, more precious than any material possession and more powerful than any amount of money in their ability to create transformation and healing. As summer reached its peak, with Chicago basking in the kind of perfect weather that made its residents forget winter's brutality and appreciate their city's unique beauty, Rosa's position in the Carrington household seemed secure and beneficial for everyone involved. The family was healthier and happier, the house functioned more efficiently, and Rosa herself had found satisfaction in work that utilized her skills and honored her values while providing income sufficient for her needs and obligations. But beneath this apparent stability, forces were gathering that would test everyone's character and reveal the depth of transformation that Rosa's presence had actually achieved. Jessica, now 18 and about to begin her freshman year at Northwestern University, was struggling with anxieties about leaving home and independence that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Robert's business was facing challenges from market volatility that threatened investments he had assumed were secure. And within the household itself, jealousies and insecurities that had been suppressed rather than resolved were beginning to surface in ways that would soon demand resolution. The testing that was coming would reveal whether the changes Rosa had facilitated were superficial adjustments to temporary circumstances or genuine transformations that could withstand pressure and adversity. It would demonstrate whether the respect and affection the family had developed for Rosa was strong enough to survive challenges that would tempt them to revert to the selfish patterns that had characterized their relationships before her arrival. Most importantly, it would test Rosa herself, challenging her to maintain her grace and dignity when faced with accusations and treatment that would exceed anything she had previously endured in her years of service to wealthy families who had never learned to see past their own privilege and recognize the full humanity of those who served them with such devotion and competence. The crisis, when it came, would arrive with the suddenness of summer thunderstorms that sweep across Lake Michigan, predictable in their inevitability, but shocking in their intensity and destructive power. And like those storms, it would clear the air and reveal landscapes that had been hidden by the haze of comfortable assumptions and unexamined prejudices, forcing everyone to see themselves in each other with clarity that was both painful and liberating. August in Chicago brought the kind of oppressive heat that turned the city into a furnace, with concrete and steel radiating temperatures that made even short walks feel like endurance tests. The air conditioning systems in the Carrington mansion worked overtime, creating artificial climate that allowed the family to remain comfortable while the rest of the city sweltered through another summer of record-breaking temperatures. But despite the controlled environment, tensions within the household were building toward a confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace Rosa had helped create over the previous 6 months. Jessica's anxiety about starting college had manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that worried her family and challenged Rosa's patient management of household dynamics. The young woman who had been learning to treat Rosa with respect and even affection was now volatile and unpredictable, her emotions swinging between desperate need for support and angry rejection of anyone who tried to provide help. The expensive therapy sessions that Robert had arranged seemed to be making her condition worse rather than better, as if professional analysis of her feelings was somehow less helpful than the simple acceptance and practical care Rosa had provided during earlier crises. The situation reached a crisis point during the last weekend of August, when Jessica was preparing for her departure to Northwestern University. The family had planned a small farewell dinner, nothing elaborate but meaningful, as a way of marking this transition in Jessica's life and demonstrating their support for her independence. Rosa had spent extra time preparing the dining room, arranging flowers from the garden, and ensuring that every detail reflected the love and pride that Robert and Michael felt for Jessica's achievements. But Jessica's mood that evening was darker than anyone had anticipated. She arrived at dinner having clearly been drinking, her speech slightly slurred, and her movements unsteady in ways that suggested this was not her first experiment with alcohol as a coping mechanism. The conversation quickly became strained as Robert tried to maintain celebratory tone while monitoring his daughter's condition, and Michael retreated into uncomfortable silence that reflected his own anxieties about family dynamics he was too young to fully understand. The explosion came during dessert, when Jessica knocked over her water glass and immediately began blaming Rosa for placing it too close to her plate. The accusation was absurd. Rosa hadn't even served the meal, which had been Elena's responsibility, but Jessica's anger was looking for any target, and Rosa's presence made her a convenient scapegoat for frustrations that had nothing to do with household management and everything to do with fears about growing up and leaving home. "She's always moving things around," Jessica complained, her voice rising with each word. "I can never find anything in my own room because she's constantly rearranging everything without asking. It's like having some stranger controlling my personal space." Robert and Michael exchanged glances that reflected their recognition of how unfair Jessica's comments were. Rosa's care of Jessica's room had been consistently respectful and helpful, improving organization and cleanliness while never disturbing personal items or private spaces. But alcoholic emotions don't respond to logical arguments, and Jessica's tirade was just beginning. "And another thing," she continued, her inhibitions completely dissolved by alcohol and anxiety. "I don't understand why we need someone here all the time, watching everything we do, probably gossiping about us with her friends. How do we even know we can trust her? How do we know she's not taking things?" The accusation of theft hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything Rosa had built through months of patient service and genuine care. Rosa herself remained seated at the small table in the adjoining breakfast nook where she took her meals when working late, her face calm but her hands clasped tightly in her lap in a way that revealed the impact of Jessica's words. Robert's initial response was firm but measured, reflecting his own growth in emotional maturity that Rosa's presence had fostered. "Jessica, you're upset about leaving for college, and that's understandable," he said quietly. "But that doesn't give you the right to say hurtful things about Rosa, who has done nothing but help our family for the past 6 months." But Jessica's alcohol-fueled emotions were beyond reach of reasonable discussion. Her fears about college, her unresolved grief about her mother's death, her insecurities about whether she was capable of independence, and her guilt about how badly she had treated Rosa during her first weeks of employment combined into a toxic mixture that sought release through destructive anger. "I want her gone," Jessica announced, her voice carrying the imperious tone she had perfected during years of getting her way through tantrums and emotional manipulation. "I don't want some stranger in our house, touching our things, pretending to care about us just because we pay her. I want her out before I leave for college." The silence that followed this ultimatum was profound and painful. Michael stared at his sister with shocked dismay, recognizing the cruelty in her words, even if he lacked the maturity to effectively challenge her behavior. Robert found himself facing a crisis that tested everything he had learned about leadership, responsibility, and moral courage during the months of Rosa's employment. Rosa herself rose quietly from her chair and began clearing the dishes from the main dining table, her movements steady and purposeful despite the emotional assault she had just endured. She had faced similar accusations before. Wealthy employers often found it convenient to blame their domestic staff for problems that had other causes, but this situation felt more personally painful because she had allowed herself to believe that her relationship with this family was different, that the months of patient service and genuine care had created bonds strong enough to withstand temporary emotional storms. Robert's response to this crisis would define not only Rosa's future with the family, but also his own character and his relationship with his children. The easy path would be to give in to Jessica's demands, to treat Rosa as expendable and maintain peace with his daughter during her final days at home. The difficult but morally correct path would be to stand up for what was right, to defend Rosa against unfair accusations, and to demonstrate to his children that integrity mattered more than temporary comfort. But Robert's business training had taught him to avoid confrontation when possible, to minimize risk and maintain stability, even if that meant making compromises that weren't entirely fair to all parties involved. His instinct was to find middle ground, to somehow satisfy Jessica's demands while not completely betraying Rosa's loyalty and service. This instinct, while well-intentioned, represented the kind of moral cowardice that allowed injustice to flourish through the passive cooperation of good people who lacked courage to take difficult stands. "Perhaps," Robert said slowly, his voice reflecting uncertainty rather than leadership, "it would be better if Rosa took a brief vacation while Jessica adjusts to being away at college. Just temporary, until everyone's emotions settle down." The words hit Rosa like physical blows, not because they were intentionally cruel, but because they represented the casual dismissal she had experienced so many times throughout her working life. The assumption that her needs and feelings mattered less than the comfort of those she served, that her loyalty and competence could be set aside whenever it became inconvenient to acknowledge her value. Rosa nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and dignity despite the circumstances. She removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter where she had prepared so many meals that had brought the family together around tables that had been empty and silent before her arrival. "I understand," she said quietly, her accented English carrying no bitterness despite the injustice of her dismissal. "I will collect my personal items and leave tonight." The finality in her voice shocked even Jessica, whose anger was beginning to be replaced by uncomfortable recognition of what her tantrum had accomplished. But pride and alcohol prevented her from backing down, and she watched in sullen silence as Rosa prepared to leave the family that had benefited immeasurably from her presence. Michael found his voice first, his youth giving him courage that his father's experience had compromised. "This isn't fair," he said firmly, looking directly at his sister rather than avoiding the confrontation that his family had taught him to fear. "Rosa hasn't done anything wrong. You're just scared about college and taking it out on her." But his words came too late to change the momentum of events that Robert had set in motion through his failure to immediately defend Rosa against accusations he knew were false. Rosa gathered her few personal belongings, a sweater, her lunch bag, a small plant that Carlos had given her from the greenhouse, and prepared to leave the mansion where she had invested months of her life in creating warmth and stability for people who were now treating her as dispensable. Robert walked Rosa to the service entrance, his discomfort evident, but his resolve apparently firm. He handed her an envelope containing 2 weeks' salary, the standard severance for domestic employees whose services were no longer required. The gesture was financially adequate but emotionally devastating, reducing months of devoted service to a simple business transaction. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret, but not enough courage to change his decision. "You've been excellent, and I'll provide strong references for any future positions." Rosa accepted the envelope with the same dignity she had brought to every aspect of her work, never allowing the circumstances of her dismissal to diminish her sense of personal worth. She had survived worse injustices than this, and her strength came from sources that couldn't be touched by the casual cruelty of employers who had forgotten how to see past their own privilege. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve your family," she replied, her words chosen carefully to maintain professionalism, even in this moment of rejection. "I hope things work out well for everyone." And then she was gone, walking down Michigan Avenue toward the bus stop that would begin her journey back to the South Side, leaving behind a mansion that would soon discover how much they had depended on her presence to maintain the illusion of a functional household. The summer heat that had been kept at bay by expensive air conditioning seemed to rush in through the doors she had closed behind her, carrying with it the reality that comfort and happiness required more than money to sustain. They required the kind of care and attention that Rosa had provided and that could not be purchased from any agency or replaced by any technology. The immediate aftermath of Rosa's departure revealed the extent to which the Carrington household had become dependent on her competence and care. Within days, small problems began accumulating into larger difficulties that exposed the inadequacy of their previous systems and highlighted how much Rosa had contributed beyond her official job description. The mansion's daily operations, which had run smoothly under Rosa's management, began showing signs of strain and inefficiency. Meals appeared late or were forgotten entirely. Important appointments were missed due to scheduling oversights, and the house itself began losing the warmth and comfort that had made it feel like a home rather than simply an expensive showcase. But more significantly, the family's emotional well-being deteriorated rapidly without Rosa's stabilizing presence. Michael's improvement in appetite and mood reversed dramatically, and he began retreating to his room with the same withdrawn behavior that had characterized his pre-Rosa period. Jessica, preparing for departure to Northwestern, found herself unable to cope with anxieties that Rosa's practical wisdom had previously helped her manage. Robert, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning with the consequences of his decision. His business instincts had told him to minimize immediate conflict by giving in to Jessica's demands, but the results of this strategy were proving far more costly than the temporary discomfort of standing up for what was right would have been. The house he had thought was functioning well was revealed to have been held together by Rosa's invisible contributions, and without her presence, the family dynamics that had seemed healthily improved began reverting to the patterns of isolation and dysfunction that had characterized their lives before her arrival. As autumn approached Chicago with its annual reminder that all seasons of comfort eventually give way to periods of testing and endurance, the Carrington family was about to discover that some losses cannot be easily replaced, and that integrity and loyalty, once betrayed, are not easily restored. The consequences of choosing convenience over justice were about to be measured not just in domestic inconvenience, but in the deeper currency of character and the fundamental question of what kind of people they were willing to be when their values were tested by pressure and fear. September arrived in Chicago with the crisp promise of autumn, but the Carrington mansion felt trapped in a winter that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the absence that Rosa's departure had created. The family had assumed that replacing a domestic worker would be simple, a matter of calling the agency and selecting another competent employee from their roster of available candidates. But as days turned into weeks, they discovered that Rosa's contributions to their household had extended far beyond cleaning and basic maintenance into realms that couldn't be easily replicated by someone who lacked her particular combination of skills, experience, and genuine care for their well-being. The immediate practical problems were frustrating but manageable. The replacement housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, was professionally trained and adequately competent, but she approached her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone fulfilling a contract rather than caring for a family. Rooms were cleaned to acceptable standards, but they lacked the subtle touches that had made them feel welcoming and comfortable. Meals appeared when scheduled, but they were nutritionally adequate rather than emotionally nourishing. prepared according to dietary requirements rather than understanding of individual preferences and family dynamics. More troubling were the cascading effects of Rosa's absence on the family's emotional equilibrium. Jessica had departed for Northwestern University in a state of anxiety and guilt that she couldn't articulate. Her final days at home shadowed by uncomfortable awareness of how badly she had behaved and how much damage her tantrum had caused. Her phone calls home were brief and strained, filled with complaints about college life that seemed to mask deeper regrets about the way she had left things. Michael's regression was particularly painful to observe. The young man who had begun emerging from adolescent withdrawal under Rosa's patient encouragement reverted to spending most of his time isolated in his bedroom, emerging only for meals that he ate in silence before retreating again to the solitary activities that had characterized his pre-Rosa existence. His appetite, which had improved dramatically under Rosa's care, diminished to the point where Robert began worrying about his physical health as well as his emotional state. But the most significant impact was on Robert himself, who found himself struggling with guilt and regret that affected both his personal well-being and his professional performance. The business decisions that had once seemed straightforward now felt complicated by ethical considerations he had previously managed to ignore. His portfolio of investments, including stocks in companies whose labor practices he had never questioned, cryptocurrency holdings whose environmental impact he had never considered, and real estate ventures whose effects on local communities he had never examined, suddenly seemed to reflect moral choices rather than purely financial calculations. Sleep became elusive as Robert found himself replaying the scene of Rosa's dismissal, imagining different responses he could have made, different words he could have chosen, different principles he could have demonstrated to his children about justice, loyalty, and the treatment of those who serve others with dedication and competence. The comfortable rationalization that he had acted to preserve family peace was gradually replaced by uncomfortable recognition that he had betrayed someone who had trusted him and had contributed immeasurably to his family's happiness and well-being. The absence of Rosa's calming presence was particularly evident during the family's attempts to maintain the Sunday dinner tradition that had become one of their few successful connections. Without Rosa's subtle contributions to atmosphere and comfort, these meals became awkward affairs that highlighted their inability to communicate authentically with each other. The dining room, which had felt warm and inviting under Rosa's care, now seemed formal and intimidating, its expensive furnishings creating barriers rather than bringing the family together. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, made several attempts to discuss Rosa's dismissal with Robert, her professional politeness barely masking disapproval of how the situation had been handled. She had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the difference between employees who were simply competent and those who were genuinely devoted to the well-being of those they served, and she understood that Rosa belonged to the rare second category that should never be casually dismissed. Rosa was special, Mrs. Henderson said during one of their weekly household meetings, her words carefully chosen but unmistakably critical. She cared about this family in ways that go beyond professional obligations. Finding someone with her combination of skills and dedication will be very difficult, if not impossible. But Robert's pride prevented him from acknowledging his mistake directly, even as its consequences became increasingly apparent. Business leaders learn to project confidence and decisiveness even when they're uncertain, and admitting error feels like weakness that might undermine authority and effectiveness. Instead of openly reconsidering his decision about Rosa, he focused on managing the symptoms of her absence, hiring additional services to handle tasks she had managed seamlessly, consulting with therapists about Michael's regression, arranging for professional organizers to maintain systems that Rosa had managed intuitively. These stopgap measures were expensive and ultimately inadequate, but they allowed Robert to avoid confronting the fundamental question of whether he had acted justly when faced with a choice between convenient compromise and moral courage. The bills for these additional services served as constant reminders of Rosa's value, but Robert interpreted them as necessary costs of maintaining household efficiency rather than evidence of his failure to appreciate and protect someone who had contributed immeasurably to his family's well-being. Elena, the part-time cook, began expressing concerns about the family's nutritional health and emotional state during their weekly menu planning sessions. She had observed the positive changes that occurred during Rosa's tenure and was witnessing their rapid reversal now that Rosa was gone. Her perspective as someone who had worked in domestic service for decades gave her insight into family dynamics that Robert's business training hadn't prepared him to understand. "The family was happier when Rosa was here," Elena said bluntly during one of their conversations. "They ate better, talked more, seemed to enjoy being together. Without her, they're becoming like so many wealthy families I've worked for, isolated from each other despite living in the same house, successful in business but struggling with the basics of human connection." These observations were accurate but painful, forcing Robert to confront evidence of his family's deterioration that couldn't be addressed through hiring additional services or consulting with professionals. The fundamental problem wasn't lack of competent help, but absence of someone who had genuinely cared about their well-being and had possessed the wisdom and patience to address emotional needs that money couldn't satisfy. Carlos, the gardener, provided another perspective on Rosa's impact and the consequences of her departure. He had worked with her to coordinate indoor and outdoor spaces in ways that created unified environments supporting relaxation and connection, and he had observed how her presence had affected the family's interactions with their physical environment. Without Rosa's influence, the mansion was reverting to the sterile showcase it had been before her arrival, beautiful but unwelcoming, impressive but emotionally cold. Rosa understood that houses need love to become homes, he explained in his limited but expressive English. She knew how to make spaces feel safe and comfortable, not just clean and organized. Without her, this place feels empty again, no matter how much furniture and art it contains. As October progressed, with Chicago's famous autumn colors providing stunning beauty that the family was too distracted to appreciate, the cumulative impact of Rosa's absence became impossible to ignore. The mansion functioned adequately on a practical level, but it had lost the intangible qualities that had made it feel like a place where people could find comfort, connection, and the emotional nourishment necessary for genuine happiness and growth. Robert's attempts to maintain business as usual were increasingly strained by the recognition that his personal life had become a source of constant low-level stress and regret rather than the foundation of satisfaction and motivation it had briefly become under Rosa's influence. His investment portfolio continued growing, his business ventures remained profitable, and his net worth reached new heights that should have provided satisfaction and security. But these material successes felt hollow without the personal relationships and emotional well-being that had flourished during Rosa's brief tenure with the family. The crisis that would force Robert to confront his mistake directly was building through the accumulation of small problems that revealed the inadequacy of their current arrangements and the depth of their dependence on Rosa's contributions to their daily lives and long-term happiness. Like many moral crises, it would arrive not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual recognition that convenience and cowardice were proving far more expensive than courage and justice would have been. The reckoning was approaching, carried on autumn winds that stripped leaves from trees and revealed landscapes that had been hidden by summer's abundant growth, forcing everyone to see clearly what had been obscured by comfort and assumption, and to make choices that would determine whether this family could find their way back to the happiness and connection they had briefly experienced, or whether they would remain trapped in the isolation and dysfunction that wealth without wisdom inevitably creates. October's chill had settled over Chicago, and with it came the harsh clarity that often accompanies seasonal transitions. The Carrington mansion, despite its sophisticated heating system and expensive insulation, felt cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the absence of warmth that Rosa had brought to their daily lives. What had initially seemed like a temporary inconvenience was revealing itself as a fundamental loss that affected every aspect of their household operations and family dynamics. The breaking point came through an incident that perfectly illustrated how much Rosa's invisible contributions had mattered. Michael, who had continued his downward spiral since Rosa's departure, had been struggling with a school assignment that required research into environmental justice issues. The topic had triggered memories of conversations with Rosa about her neighborhood's challenges with pollution and industrial waste, discussions that had opened his eyes to realities that his privileged upbringing had shielded him from experiencing directly. Unable to concentrate in the mansion's cold perfection, Michael had wandered into Rosa's former workspace, a small room adjacent to the kitchen where she had kept supplies and occasionally taken brief breaks during long days. Mrs. Thompson had converted this space into a storage closet, efficiently organizing cleaning supplies and equipment in ways that maximized storage capacity but eliminated any trace of the personal touches that had made it Rosa's sanctuary within the household. Behind a box of vacuum cleaner bags, Michael discovered something that Mrs. Thompson had missed during her reorganization: a small notebook in which Rosa had kept records of household tasks, family preferences, and scheduling notes that had helped her manage the complex logistics of caring for their needs. But interspersed with these practical notations were personal observations that revealed the depth of Rosa's attention to their individual well-being and her genuine concern for their happiness and growth. Michael eating better this week. Try making soup again on Thursday, read one entry. Jessica worried about college applications. Maybe suggest she talk to father about her concerns. Mr. Carrington working too late again? Leave healthy snacks in office. These notes revealed that Rosa had been studying their needs and moods with the attention of someone who genuinely cared about their welfare, not just fulfilling job requirements, but actively seeking ways to improve their lives and strengthen their family bonds. The discovery of this notebook affected Michael profoundly, providing concrete evidence of how much Rosa had invested in their family's well-being and how thoughtfully she had approached her responsibilities. He realized that her dismissal hadn't just cost them a competent employee, but had betrayed someone who had genuinely loved and cared for them, someone whose contributions extended far beyond cleaning and basic maintenance into the realm of emotional nurturing that had made their house feel like a home for the first time since his mother's death. Michael's revelation prompted him to take action that demonstrated maturity and moral courage beyond his 16 years. Rather than accepting the situation passively, he began his own investigation into Rosa's current circumstances, using social media and community resources to track down information about what had happened to her since her dismissal from their household. What he discovered both inspired and devastated him. Rosa had not found another position with a wealthy family, despite Robert's promise to provide strong references. The domestic service industry in Chicago was competitive and often based on personal recommendations and established networks that Rosa, as someone who had worked for only a few families over her career, didn't have extensive access to. Instead, she had returned to the kind of multiple part-time jobs that characterized employment for many working-class women: cleaning office buildings at night, providing elder care during the day, taking on any tasks that would provide income sufficient to meet her ongoing obligations to her parents and her community. More troubling was Michael's discovery that Rosa's apartment building had indeed been sold to developers, and that she and her elderly neighbors had been forced to relocate to housing that was both more expensive and farther from the medical facilities and community resources they depended on. The stress of this displacement, combined with the uncertainty of irregular employment, had affected Rosa's health and complicated her ability to care for her parents, whose conditions had worsened without the stability that Rosa's steady income from the Carrington household had previously provided. This information prompted Michael to make a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He confronted his father directly. presenting the notebook and the information he had gathered about Rosa's current situation, and demanding that Robert acknowledge the injustice of her dismissal and take action to remedy the situation. "We fired Rosa because Jessica threw a tantrum," Michael said, his voice carrying conviction that belied his youth. "We didn't even listen to her side of the story or consider what she had contributed to our family. She made us happy for the first time since Mom died, and we threw her away like garbage because it was easier than standing up to Jessica's selfishness." Robert's initial response was defensive, reflecting the discomfort that all parents feel when their children challenge their decisions and moral authority. He attempted to justify his handling of the situation by emphasizing the complexity of family dynamics and the importance of maintaining peace during Jessica's transition to college. But Michael's evidence, both the notebook revealing Rosa's devotion to their family and the information about her current struggles, made these rationalizations sound hollow and self-serving. "You always taught me that actions have consequences," Michael continued, refusing to be dismissed or distracted by his father's attempts to change the subject. "What are the consequences of firing someone who cared about us just because it was convenient? What does that teach Jessica about how to treat people? What does it teach me about justice and loyalty?" These questions forced Robert to confront moral dimensions of his decision that he had been avoiding through focus on practical concerns and business-like problem-solving approaches that treated family relationships as if they were corporate partnerships subject to cost-benefit analysis rather than bonds requiring trust, loyalty, and moral commitment. The conversation continued over several days, with Michael persistently challenging his father's comfortable assumptions about their family's values and Robert's own character. The teenager had inherited his father's intelligence and determination, but was applying these qualities to moral questions rather than financial ones, demonstrating that privilege could either corrupt or inspire, depending on how it was channeled and what principles guided its application. Jessica's return for Thanksgiving break provided additional pressure for resolution. Her college experience had been difficult, marked by homesickness and social anxiety that she couldn't overcome through the expensive counseling services available at Northwestern. She found herself constantly thinking about Rosa, not with continued anger, but with growing awareness of how much comfort and stability Rosa had provided during the challenging final months of high school. The reunion dinner was awkward and strained, with Jessica's obvious unhappiness casting a shadow over what should have been a celebration of family togetherness. Mrs. Thompson had prepared an adequate meal, but it lacked the touches that had made Rosa's contributions so special. The understanding of individual preferences, the attention to emotional as well as nutritional needs, the subtle ways that food could express care and create connection. During the meal, Jessica made an unexpected confession that caught both Robert and Michael off guard. "I've been thinking about Rosa," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the angry defiance that had characterized her previous discussions of their former housekeeper. "I think I was wrong about her. I was scared about college and took it out on her because she was the safest target. But she never did anything wrong, did she?" This admission opened the door for honest conversation about what had happened and what could be done to address the injustice of Rosa's dismissal. Jessica's growing maturity, combined with Michael's moral clarity and research into Rosa's current situation, created pressure that Robert could no longer resist through defensive justifications and practical diversions. The family discussion that followed was painful but necessary, forcing all of them to confront uncomfortable truths about their behavior and values. They had to acknowledge that Rosa's dismissal had been unfair, that their treatment of someone who had genuinely cared for them had been thoughtless and cruel, and that their comfortable assumptions about their own decency had been revealed as inadequate when tested by pressure and fear. But recognition of error was only the first step toward redemption. The more difficult question was whether Rosa would be willing to forgive their betrayal and return to a household that had proven capable of discarding her loyalty and dedication when it became temporarily inconvenient. And even if she were willing to consider reconciliation, The damage done to her life and circumstances might be too significant to easily repair. The conversation that evening marked a turning point in the family's moral development, but it also raised questions about accountability and redemption that couldn't be answered through discussion alone. Actions would be required, difficult, expensive, and potentially embarrassing actions that would test whether their newfound awareness of Rosa's value could be translated into meaningful efforts to repair the harm their selfishness and cowardice had caused. As Thanksgiving weekend drew to a close, with Jessica preparing to return to Northwestern and Michael facing the prospect of continuing his final years of high school in a household that felt emotionally barren without Rosa's presence, the family faced a choice that would define their character and their future. They could continue living with the consequences of their mistake, accepting the loss of happiness and connection as the price of their moral failure, or they could find the courage to pursue justice and redemption even if it required admitting error and risking further rejection. The decision they made would determine not only Rosa's future, but their own, testing whether wealth and privilege could be combined with genuine humility and moral courage, or whether the comfortable patterns of selfishness and expedience would ultimately prove too powerful to overcome. The winter that was approaching would either bring renewed warmth to the mansion through the restoration of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care, or it would confirm that some opportunities for redemption, once lost, could not be recovered regardless of how sincerely they are eventually sought. November's gray skies reflected the mood that had settled over the Carrington mansion like a persistent fog that no amount of artificial lighting could dispel. The family's Thanksgiving conversation had created an uncomfortable awareness of their collective failure. But awareness alone couldn't repair the damage they had done or restore the happiness they had carelessly discarded when they dismissed Rosa from their lives. The autumn that should have been a season of gratitude and reflection had become instead a time of reckoning with consequences that extended far beyond their own household and touched the life of someone whose loyalty they had repaid with betrayal. Robert found himself unable to concentrate on business matters that had previously commanded his complete attention. Market fluctuations that should have prompted immediate strategic responses seemed less urgent than the growing recognition that his personal failures were affecting every aspect of his life. The investment portfolio that had grown steadily throughout Rosa's tenure with the family continued performing well financially, but the numbers on his monthly statements felt hollow and meaningless without the foundation of genuine relationships and moral satisfaction that had briefly made wealth feel like a tool for creating happiness rather than simply accumulating more wealth. His attempts to locate Rosa through conventional channels proved frustrating and ultimately futile. The employment agencies that placed domestic workers were protective of their clients' privacy and reluctant to share contact information with former employers, especially when those employers couldn't provide compelling reasons for wanting to re-establish contact. Rosa's former address was no longer valid due to the building sale that had forced her relocation, and her new residence was apparently unlisted in directories available to someone without investigative resources or legitimate authority. Michael's research had been more successful, but his information about Rosa's current circumstances was incomplete and often secondhand. Reports from community members who knew her situation, but were hesitant to share details with wealthy strangers whose motives were unclear and whose previous treatment of Rosa had become known within networks of domestic workers who shared information about employers, both good and problematic. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena, the part-time cook who had worked alongside Rosa and had maintained contact with her through mutual friends in the community, finally decided to share Rosa's new address after being convinced that the family's desire for reconciliation was genuine, rather than simply another example of wealthy guilt seeking easy absolution. Rosa is working very hard, Elena explained during her conversation with Robert, her voice carrying both protective concern for her friend and lingering disapproval of how the situation had been handled. She has 3 different jobs now, and she's helping her parents with medical expenses that insurance doesn't cover. She doesn't have time or energy for people who might hurt her again. This information provided the practical details Robert needed to locate Rosa, but it also highlighted the magnitude of disruption his decision had caused in her life. The stable employment that had allowed Rosa to maintain dignity while meeting her family obligations had been replaced by the kind of uncertain, exhausting schedule that characterizes survival rather than sustainable living. The financial security that had enabled her to send regular assistance to her parents had been disrupted at a time when their health problems required increasingly expensive care. Armed with Rosa's address but uncertain about how to approach someone he had wronged so significantly, Robert spent days crafting and discarding letters that attempted to balance acknowledgement of his mistakes with requests for forgiveness that might seem self-serving rather than genuinely repentant. Business communication had trained him to present information persuasively and manage relationships strategically, but this situation required emotional honesty and moral courage that his professional experience hadn't prepared him for. The letter he finally sent was simple and direct, avoiding elaborate justifications or excuses in favor of straightforward admission of error and expression of regret. He acknowledged that Rosa's dismissal had been unjust, that his failure to defend her against false accusations had betrayed someone who had devoted herself to his family's well-being, and that the consequences of his cowardice had affected not only their household, but Rosa's life in ways that he was only beginning to understand. More importantly, the letter included practical information about his desire to make amends through more than words alone. He offered immediate financial compensation for the income Rosa had lost during her unemployment, assistance with her parents' medical expenses, and help in finding stable housing that would restore the security that his decision had disrupted. But beyond these material offers, he requested an opportunity to apologize in person and to discuss whether any form of reconciliation might be possible. Rosa's written response came 2 weeks later, delivered through Elena rather than direct mail, a choice that suggested continuing caution about direct contact, but also willingness to engage with the family's attempts at reconciliation. Her letter was gracious but reserved, acknowledging Robert's apology and his offers of assistance while making clear that forgiveness could not be assumed or purchased through financial compensation alone. "I appreciate your recognition that mistakes were made," Rosa wrote in careful English that carried dignity despite its occasional awkwardness. "I also appreciate your offers of help, which I will consider based on my family's needs rather than any obligation to make your family feel better about what happened. If you would like to meet to discuss this situation, I am willing to listen to what you have to say." The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in December, when Chicago's early winter had transformed the city into a landscape of stark beauty that seemed appropriate for a conversation about redemption and the possibility of forgiveness. Rosa suggested meeting at a small cafe in her neighborhood, neutral territory that would allow her to maintain control over the encounter while avoiding the emotional complexity of returning to the mansion where she had invested so much care and received such disappointing treatment in return. Robert's journey to Rosa's neighborhood was a physical movement through Chicago's economic geography, but also an emotional journey into recognition of realities he had previously managed to ignore. The South Side streets where Rosa lived were lined with buildings that showed both pride and struggle, houses carefully maintained despite obvious age and limited resources, small businesses that served working-class communities with dignity and determination, community centers and churches that provided social services that government programs couldn't adequately address. The cafe where they met was typical of establishments that served neighborhood residents rather than seeking to attract tourists or wealthy visitors from other parts of the city. The menu offered simple, affordable food prepared with care, and the customers were primarily local residents conducting the routine business of daily life. Elderly men sharing coffee and conversation, mothers managing children while handling household errands, workers grabbing quick meals between shifts at jobs that paid hourly wages rather than annual salaries. Rosa was waiting when Robert arrived, occupying a corner table that provided privacy for their conversation. while allowing her to observe the entrance and maintain awareness of her surroundings. She was dressed simply but neatly in clothing that appeared well-maintained despite obvious age, and her posture conveyed both dignity and caution as she prepared for a conversation that would determine whether reconciliation was possible or whether this meeting would simply provide closure to a relationship that had ended badly. The conversation that followed was unlike any Robert had experienced in his business or social life. Rosa listened patiently while he attempted to explain his thinking during the crisis that led to her dismissal, but she didn't offer easy forgiveness or accept his justifications for choosing family peace over moral courage. Instead, she asked questions that forced him to confront the deeper implications of his decision and its effects not only on her life, but on his children's understanding of justice, loyalty, and the treatment of those who serve others with devotion and competence. "What did you teach your daughter about keeping promises?" Rosa asked quietly, her voice carrying no anger but considerable firmness. "What did you teach your son about standing up for people who cannot protect themselves? These lessons will affect how they treat others for the rest of their lives." This perspective forced Robert to consider consequences of his decision that extended far beyond immediate household disruption or even the injustice done to Rosa personally. His children had been watching when he chose convenience over courage, and they had learned lessons about character and values that would influence their own behavior in future situations that tested their integrity and moral strength. But Rosa's questions also revealed her continued concern for the family's well-being, suggesting that her investment in their growth and happiness hadn't been entirely destroyed by their betrayal of her trust and loyalty. She asked about Michael's progress in school, Jessica's adjustment to college life, and Robert's own health and emotional state, with genuine interest that indicated forgiveness might be possible even if trust would require time and consistent demonstration to rebuild. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering practical questions about Rosa's current circumstances and future needs, as well as deeper issues about redemption, accountability, and the possibility of reconstructing relationships that had been damaged by selfishness and moral cowardice. By its conclusion, both participants understood that reconciliation would require more than apologies and financial compensation. It would demand ongoing demonstration of changed values and behavior that proved the family had learned from their mistakes and grown into people capable of treating others with consistent respect and appreciation. Rosa agreed to consider returning to work for the Carrington family, but only under conditions that reflected her increased understanding of her own value and her determination never again to accept treatment that diminished her dignity or security. Her terms included not only increased compensation and benefits, but also clear protocols for addressing conflicts and disagreements that would prevent future situations where family members could dismiss her arbitrarily or force her to choose between her job security and her self-respect. More significantly, Rosa insisted that her return be conditional on evidence of genuine change in the family's attitudes and behavior, rather than simply their desire to restore the comfort and stability her presence had provided. She would return for a trial period of 3 months, during which her performance would be evaluated, but during which the family's character would also be under assessment to determine whether they had truly learned from their mistakes or were simply seeking to restore convenience without addressing the underlying selfishness that had led to her dismissal. As the meeting concluded with tentative agreement on terms and timeline for Rosa's potential return, both Robert and Rosa understood that they were beginning a process that would test everyone involved in ways that would determine not only the future of their professional relationship, but also the possibility of genuine healing and growth that could transform individual character and family dynamics in lasting ways. The winter that lay ahead would either witness redemption and renewal based on mutual respect and appreciation, or it would confirm that some betrayals create damage too significant to repair, regardless of how sincerely reconciliation is eventually sought. The outcome would depend not on good intentions alone, but on sustained demonstration of changed values and consistent behavior that proved words of regret could be translated into actions worthy of forgiveness and trust. December's arrival brought Chicago's lake-effect snow, covering the city in pristine white that transformed familiar landscapes into scenes of unexpected beauty. The Carrington Mansion, its Georgian architecture perfectly suited to winter's dramatic backdrop, should have been the setting for holiday preparations and family celebrations that brought warmth to the longest nights. Instead, it remained emotionally cold despite its efficient heating system. As the family prepared for Rose's return with a mixture of hope and apprehension that reflected their understanding that this second chance might be their last opportunity to prove they had learned from their mistakes. The 3 weeks between Rose's agreement to return and her actual first day provided time for preparation that went far beyond practical arrangements about schedules, responsibilities, and compensation. Robert had insisted on family meetings that addressed not only Rose's working conditions, but also the behavior and attitudes that each family member would need to demonstrate to rebuild trust and create an environment where history wouldn't repeat itself. Jessica's return from Northwestern for winter break provided opportunity for conversations that had been impossible during the emotional crisis of her departure for college. The months away from home had given her perspective on her behavior during Rose's dismissal, and her struggles with independence had highlighted how much Rose's nurturing presence had contributed to her sense of security and stability during the transition from adolescence to young adulthood. "I was horrible to Rosa," Jessica admitted during one of their family discussions, her voice carrying genuine remorse rather than the defensive anger that had characterized her previous references to their former housekeeper. "I was scared about leaving home and growing up, and I took it out on someone who had been nothing but kind to me. I need to apologize to her directly, not just through dad or family meetings." This acknowledgement represented significant growth in Jessica's emotional maturity, but it also raised questions about whether Rosa would be willing to accept apologies that might feel insufficient, given the magnitude of disruption her dismissal had caused. The family was learning that redemption required more than recognition of wrongdoing. It demanded sustained behavior change that proved good intentions could be translated into consistent action over time. Michael's preparation for Rosa's return involved research into the community organizations and causes that Rosa supported, leading him to volunteer with a local food bank that served families in her neighborhood. These experiences provided him with first-hand exposure to the economic realities that shaped Rosa's life and the lives of others who worked in service industries that provided essential support to wealthy families while receiving minimal security or appreciation in return. Through his volunteer work, Michael began understanding the broader context of inequality and injustice that made individual situations like Rosa's particularly painful and systemically significant. He learned that Rosa's dismissal was not simply a private family matter, but an example of patterns that affected thousands of domestic workers who faced similar vulnerability to arbitrary treatment from employers who held disproportionate power over their economic security and personal dignity. This broader perspective motivated Michael to propose changes in their household employment practices that went beyond Rosa's specific situation to address structural inequities that affected all their employees. He suggested implementing formal employment contracts that provided job security protections, health insurance benefits, and clear procedures for addressing conflicts that would prevent future situations where personal feelings or family tensions could result in unjust dismissals. Robert's own preparation involved examining his business practices and investment strategies to determine whether his professional life reflected the values he claimed to have learned from Rosa's dismissal. The portfolios that had generated his wealth included companies whose treatment of employees ranged from exemplary to exploitative, and he began divesting from enterprises whose labor practices contradicted the respect for workers' dignity that he now claimed to embrace. More significantly, Robert began exploring philanthropic opportunities that would direct some of his wealth toward organizations addressing the systemic inequalities that made situations like Rosa's common rather than exceptional. Community health centers that served immigrants and working-class families, legal aid organizations that protected domestic workers' rights, and housing initiatives that prevented displacement of longtime residents became recipients of donations that represented more than tax-advantaged charity. They reflected genuine commitment to addressing root causes of problems rather than simply managing their symptoms. Mrs. Henderson, who had maintained contact with Rosa throughout her absence and had served as an informal mediator during reconciliation negotiations, provided insights into Rosa's current state of mind and realistic expectations for the transition back to employment with the family. Her perspective, informed by decades of experience with wealthy households and their often complicated relationships with domestic staff, suggested both optimism about the possibility of successful reconciliation and caution about the challenges that lay ahead. Rosa is willing to return because she believes people can change, Mrs. Henderson explained to Robert during one of their planning meetings. But she's also been hurt deeply by people she trusted, and it will take time to rebuild that trust through actions rather than words. Everyone will need to be patient with the process and consistent in demonstrating the changes they've promised to make. The practical arrangements for Rosa's return were carefully negotiated to reflect both her increased value to the household and her determination to maintain dignity and security that couldn't be compromised by family tensions or economic pressures. Her compensation was increased significantly, and she was provided with written employment agreements that specified her responsibilities, working conditions, and procedures for addressing any conflicts that might arise. More importantly, Rosa's new position included expanded authority over household management that recognized her competence and judgment in ways that her previous employment had not. She would have direct control over purchasing decisions, staff coordination, and scheduling that affected family operations, eliminating the ambiguous authority relationships that had previously left her vulnerable to criticism and arbitrary interference from family members who didn't understand the complexity of her responsibilities. The family had also agreed to regular meetings where Rosa could raise concerns or suggestions about household operations without fear of retaliation or dismissal, creating communication channels that would prevent minor problems from escalating into major conflicts. These structural changes reflected recognition that Rosa's dismissal had occurred not because of her performance failures, but because of inadequate systems for managing the emotional and practical challenges that inevitably arise in any household where multiple personalities and competing needs must be balanced. Elena, Carlos, and the other staff members who had continued working for the family during Rosa's absence prepared for her return with relief and anticipation that reflected their understanding of how much her absence had affected household operations and family dynamics. They had maintained professional standards during the months without her leadership and coordination, but they had missed the collegial atmosphere and efficient teamwork that had characterized their collaborations with someone who understood both the practical and emotional dimensions of caring for a family in crisis. The mansion itself was prepared for Rosa's return through modifications that reflected the family's recognition of her value and their commitment to providing working conditions that demonstrated respect rather than merely meeting minimum requirements. The small office space that had been converted to storage during her absence was restored and expanded, providing Rosa with private area for planning and administration that acknowledged the complexity of her responsibilities and the importance of her role in household management. As Rosa's first day back approached, each family member carried their own mixture of hope and anxiety about whether reconciliation would prove successful, or whether the damage done by her dismissal had created wounds too deep to heal through good intentions and improved circumstances. They understood that this second chance represented more than restoration of convenient household management. It was an opportunity to demonstrate whether they had truly learned from their mistakes and grown into people capable of treating others with consistent justice and appreciation. The test of their character would not be measured by dramatic gestures or expensive gifts, but by daily interactions and routine decisions that would reveal whether their expressions of regret had been translated into genuine changes in attitude and behavior that could sustain respectful relationships over time, despite inevitable pressures and conflicts that would challenge their commitment to treating Rosa with the dignity and appreciation her service deserved. Rosa's first morning back at the Carrington mansion dawned clear and cold, with Lake Michigan's frozen shore glittering under January sunlight that promised warmth but delivered the kind of brilliant chill that made Chicago winters simultaneously beautiful and brutal. She stood at the familiar service entrance, her key still fitting the lock despite months of absence, but everything else about this moment felt fundamentally different from her previous employment with the family. The terms of her return had been negotiated carefully to reflect both her increased understanding of her own value and the family's recognition that treating domestic workers with dignity required more than good intentions. It demanded structural changes in employment practices and communication patterns that prevented the kind of arbitrary dismissal that had damaged both Rosa's life and the family's moral standing. But negotiations and written agreements could only provide framework for relationships that would ultimately depend on daily interactions and sustained demonstration of mutual respect. Robert was waiting in the kitchen when Rosa arrived, his presence indicating that this day was too important to be left to routine arrivals and familiar patterns. He had clearly prepared remarks that attempted to balance professional courtesy with personal acknowledgement of the injustice of her previous dismissal. But his nervousness suggested uncertainty about how to navigate relationships that had been damaged by his own failures of character and leadership. "Rosa, welcome back," he began, his voice carrying formality that masked deeper emotions about this moment of potential redemption. "I want you to know that our family has thought carefully about the mistakes we made, and we're committed to ensuring that your employment here provides the respect and security that your work deserves." Rosa's response was gracious but reserved, acknowledging his words while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to protect herself from future disappointment if the family's good intentions proved temporary rather than sustained. "Thank you, Mr. Carrington," she replied, her voice carrying the professionalism she had maintained throughout their difficult history. "I appreciate the opportunity to return, and I hope we can build better understanding of expectations and communication that benefits everyone." The initial hours of Rosa's return were carefully managed to avoid overwhelming her with greetings and explanations, while also providing opportunities for each family member to acknowledge her presence and express their own commitment to improved relationships. Michael approached first, his youth making direct apology easier than it might have been for adults whose pride complicated admission of error. "Rosa, I'm really glad you're back," he said simply, his sincerity evident in both his words and his obvious relief at her presence. "I missed our conversations, and I learned a lot about fairness and justice while you were gone. I promise to do better at showing appreciation for everything you do for our family." Jessica's reunion with Rosa was more complex, carrying the weight of her particular responsibility for the crisis that had led to Rosa's dismissal. Her months at Northwestern had provided perspective on her behavior that made apology both necessary and difficult, requiring acknowledgement of cruelty that she was still learning to understand and regret. "Rosa, I owe you a major apology," Jessica said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion that appeared genuine rather than performed. "I was wrong about everything I said when I was leaving for college. I was scared and took it out on you, and that was unfair and cruel. I hope you can forgive me and give me a chance to show you that I've grown up some since then." Rosa's acceptance of these apologies was measured and conditional, reflecting her understanding that words needed to be followed by actions before trust could be rebuilt, and working relationships could return to the comfort and efficiency that had characterized her previous employment with the family. "I appreciate your apologies," she responded to both Michael and Jessica, "and I hope we can all learn from what happened to build better relationships going forward." The first weeks of Rosa's return were carefully observed by all parties. As everyone involved understood that this period would determine whether reconciliation was possible or whether the damage done by her dismissal had created permanent barriers to the kind of trusting collaboration that had previously made the household function smoothly while providing genuine satisfaction to both employer and employee. Rosa approached her restored responsibilities with the same competence and attention to detail that had characterized her previous work. But she also maintained emotional boundaries that protected her from the kind of personal investment that had made her dismissal particularly painful. She performed her duties excellently while avoiding the informal conversations and spontaneous acts of caring that had previously transformed routine employment into something approaching family membership. This changed dynamic was most evident in her interactions with the children, who had previously experienced Rosa's care as unconditional availability and emotional support that went far beyond her official job responsibilities. Now, while she remained kind and helpful, her availability was more clearly defined by professional boundaries that protected her emotional well-being while still providing appropriate support for their needs. Michael noticed this change most acutely, as his previous relationship with Rosa had involved the kind of maternal nurturing that had helped him through his mother's death and the emotional challenges of adolescence. Rosa still prepared his favorite foods and ensured his physical comfort, but the spontaneous conversations and emotional support that had characterized their previous relationship were replaced by more formal interactions that maintained professional distance. "Rosa seems different," Michael observed to his father during one of their regular check-ins about how the transition was proceeding. "She's still excellent at her job, but it feels like she's protecting herself from us in ways she didn't before. I understand why, but I miss the way things used to be." Robert's response reflected his own recognition that rebuilding trust would require patience and sustained demonstration of changed behavior, rather than expecting immediate return to previous intimacy. "We hurt Rosa badly when we dismissed her unfairly," he explained to his son. "It's going to take time for her to believe that we've really learned from our mistakes and won't repeat them. We need to focus on being worthy of her trust rather than expecting her to take risks with her emotional well-being just to make us feel better about what we did." This perspective represented significant growth in Robert's understanding of relationships and responsibility, but it also highlighted the ongoing consequences of moral failures that couldn't be easily repaired through financial compensation or improved employment terms. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent behavior to rebuild, and there were no guarantees that even sincere efforts at redemption would successfully restore relationships to their previous quality and depth. Jessica's interactions with Rosa during her winter break revealed both progress and limitations in her emotional development. She had clearly matured during her months at Northwestern and genuinely regretted her behavior during Rosa's dismissal, but her attempts to rebuild their relationship sometimes reflected privileged assumptions about forgiveness and reconciliation that didn't adequately account for the power dynamics involved in domestic employment. "I keep wanting Rosa to like me again," Jessica confided to her father during one of their conversations. "I apologized, and I've been much more respectful, but she's still cautious around me. I guess I didn't realize how much damage I did or how hard it would be to repair." Robert's guidance to his daughter emphasized themes that his own experience with Rosa had taught him about redemption and relationships. "Rosa has good reason to be cautious," he explained. "We showed her that our respect and appreciation were conditional and could be withdrawn when it was convenient for us. Now she needs to see sustained evidence that we've changed before she risks opening herself up to being hurt again. That's not punishment. It's wisdom." The household's daily operations under Rosa's renewed leadership gradually returned to the efficiency and warmth that had characterized the months before her dismissal, but with new elements that reflected both parties' learning from their difficult experience. Rosa's management style incorporated more explicit communication about expectations and boundaries, while family members made conscious efforts to express appreciation and respect through both words and actions. Mrs. Henderson, who had served as unofficial mediator throughout the reconciliation process, observed these changes with satisfaction, tempered by realism about the ongoing challenges of maintaining respectful relationships across differences in economic position and social power. Her decades of experience with wealthy families had taught her that good intentions were common, but sustained behavior change was rare, particularly when it required genuine humility and consistent effort rather than occasional gestures. "Rosa's return is going well so far," Mrs. Henderson reported to Robert during one of their regular meetings. "But everyone is still being careful with each other. It will take months, maybe years, to rebuild the kind of trust and comfort that existed before. The family needs to understand that Rosa's caution is healthy self-protection, not rejection of their efforts to make amends." As winter progressed toward spring, the success of Rosa's return became increasingly evident in both practical and emotional dimensions. The mansion operated with improved efficiency that reflected better communication and clearer expectations, while family members developed more mature appreciation for the complexity of Rosa's contributions to their daily comfort and long-term well-being. But the most significant changes were in individual character development that extended far beyond household management into fundamental questions about justice, loyalty, and the treatment of others. Robert's business practices increasingly reflected concern for employee welfare and community impact that had been largely absent from his previous focus on financial returns. Michael's volunteer work and academic interests had been shaped by his experience with Rosa's dismissal into commitment to social justice that would influence his career choices and personal values. Jessica's college experience was being informed by new awareness of privilege and responsibility that made her more thoughtful about relationships and more sensitive to power dynamics that she had previously taken for granted. These changes suggested that Rosa's return represented more than restoration of convenient household management. It had catalyzed personal growth and moral development that would have lasting impact on how each family member understood their responsibilities to others and their obligation to use privilege and wealth in ways that honored rather than exploited those who served them with dedication and competence. The spring that was approaching would test whether these changes were deep enough to sustain long-term transformation, or whether they represented temporary adjustments that would fade as the immediate lessons of Rosa's dismissal became distant memories overshadowed by new challenges and competing priorities. Spring's arrival in Chicago brought the kind of dramatic transformation that made the city's residents feel they had survived another test of endurance and earned the right to appreciate beauty and warmth that couldn't be taken for granted after months of cold that challenged both physical comfort and emotional resilience. The Carrington Mansion, its gardens awakening under Carlos's expert care and Rosa's thoughtful coordination, seemed to participate in this seasonal renewal with changes that went deeper than landscaping and reflected genuine growth in the relationships that gave meaning to the impressive architecture and expensive furnishings. By April, Rosa had been back with the family for 4 months, and the initial caution that had characterized everyone's behavior was gradually being replaced by more natural interactions that suggested healing was possible even if complete restoration of previous intimacy might never be achieved. The professional boundaries that Rosa had established to protect herself were being maintained, but they no longer felt like barriers preventing genuine care and mutual appreciation from flourishing within appropriate limits. Michael's 18th birthday provided an opportunity to test whether the family had truly learned to appreciate Rosa's contributions in ways that went beyond taking her service for granted. Rather than the elaborate parties that had characterized previous family celebrations, Michael requested a simple dinner that focused on intimate family connection rather than impressive display. And he specifically asked Rosa to help plan the menu based on foods that held personal meaning for their family's history together. The dinner that resulted was a masterpiece of emotional significance rather than expensive ingredients. dishes that reminded each family member of moments when Rose's care had provided comfort during difficult times, prepared with attention to preferences and memories that couldn't be purchased from any catering service, but required the kind of personal investment that characterized Rose's approach to her work from the beginning. "This chicken soup is exactly what I needed when I was sick and couldn't eat anything else," Michael observed during the dinner, his comment directed both to Rosa and to his family as acknowledgement of specific care that had made a difference in his life. "Thank you for knowing exactly what would help and taking the time to make it perfect." Rosa's response was warm but measured, reflecting her pleasure at being appreciated while maintaining the emotional boundaries that protected her from assuming that expressions of gratitude guaranteed future security and respect. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," she replied simply. "It's always satisfying to provide food that brings comfort and helps people feel better." But the conversation that followed revealed deeper changes in family behavior that suggested genuine growth rather than temporary performance, designed to maintain Rose's employment. Jessica, home from Northwestern for spring break, had used her college experiences to gain perspective on household dynamics and employment relationships that enabled her to appreciate Rose's contributions in ways that were both more mature and more personally meaningful than her previous casual acceptance of domestic service as natural entitlement. "I've learned so much about social justice and labor rights in my classes," Jessica shared during dinner, her comments directed to Rosa with genuine interest in her perspective rather than academic abstraction. "I realize now that I never understood how hard it is to do the kind of work you do while also managing your own family responsibilities and dealing with employers who might not appreciate everything you contribute to making their lives better." Rose's engagement with this topic was careful but genuine, reflecting her recognition that Jessica's interest appeared sincere while maintaining awareness that academic understanding and personal behavior didn't always align consistently. "Every job has challenges," Rosa responded diplomatically. "But working for families can be particularly complex because it involves caring for people's most personal needs and spaces while maintaining professional relationships that respect everyone's boundaries and dignity." The conversation continued in directions that would have been impossible during Rosa's initial employment, when family members had assumed their comfort and convenience were her primary concerns rather than understanding that her work required balancing their needs with her own well-being and that of her family. Now, questions about Rosa's parents' health and her community involvements were asked with genuine concern rather than polite formality, and her responses revealed aspects of her life that enriched everyone's understanding of the full person behind the professional service. Robert's participation in these conversations reflected his own growth in understanding the human dimensions of employment relationships and the moral obligations that wealth created toward those whose labor made comfortable lifestyles possible. His questions about Rosa's neighborhood and community involvement led to discussions of broader social issues that connected her personal experiences with larger patterns of inequality and justice that his previous focus on financial success had enabled him to ignore. "I've been learning about community development and affordable housing initiatives," Robert shared with Rosa during one of their conversations, "and I realize that the economic pressures affecting your neighborhood are connected to investment patterns and development policies that people like me have supported without thinking about their impact on longtime residents and working families." This recognition had prompted Robert to modify his investment portfolio to exclude companies whose labor practices or community impact conflicted with values he now claimed to embrace. But more significantly, it had led him to direct philanthropic resources toward organizations addressing root causes of problems that affected people like Rosa, rather than simply donating to high-profile charities that provided tax benefits while avoiding systemic change. Rosa's response to these initiatives was appreciative but cautious, reflecting her understanding that good intentions needed to be sustained through consistent behavior over time before they could be trusted as reliable indicators of character change. It's encouraging to hear that you're thinking about these connections, she told Robert, and I hope your involvement with community organizations will help you understand how policy decisions affect real people's daily lives. The spring months also brought opportunities for Rosa to demonstrate her own growth and resilience in ways that revealed how her experience with the Carrington family had affected her understanding of professional relationships and personal boundaries. When approached by other domestic workers seeking advice about employment challenges, Rosa shared insights gained through her difficult experience that helped others navigate similar situations with greater awareness of their rights and dignity. Her ability to maintain professional excellence while protecting emotional well-being became a model for other women in similar positions, and her willingness to speak openly about the importance of written employment agreements and clear communication channels helped create informal networks of mutual support that strengthened the entire community of domestic workers in Chicago's wealthy neighborhoods. But Rosa's most significant growth was evident in her ability to extend forgiveness while maintaining wisdom about relationship boundaries that protected her from repeating vulnerable situations. She had learned to appreciate the genuine changes in the Carrington family's behavior, while remaining realistic about the ongoing challenges of employment relationships that involve significant power imbalances and potential for misunderstanding or conflict. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending that hurtful things didn't happen, Rosa explained to Elena during one of their conversations about the complexities of returning to work for employers who had previously demonstrated poor judgment about employee treatment. It means choosing not to let past injuries prevent you from moving forward, while also being smart about protecting yourself from similar situations in the future. This wisdom was being demonstrated daily through Rosa's interactions with the family, which had achieved a balance between genuine care and professional boundaries that protected everyone involved while allowing meaningful relationships to flourish within appropriate limits. The warmth and efficiency that had characterized the household during her initial employment had been restored, but with added elements of mutual respect and clear communication that made the relationships more sustainable and equitable. As spring progressed toward summer, with Chicago emerging into the season of festivals and outdoor celebrations that reminded residents why they endured harsh winters, the Carrington household had achieved a stability and happiness that felt more genuine and sustainable than their previous comfortable but emotionally disconnected existence. Rosa's presence continued to be essential to their daily operations and emotional well-being, but now her contributions were recognized and appreciated in ways that honored her dignity and acknowledged her full humanity. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the family's Sunday dinners, which had evolved from stilted attempts at connection into genuine celebrations of their shared life that included Rosa as a valued member rather than invisible servant. These meals, prepared collaboratively and enjoyed an atmosphere of mutual appreciation, represented the kind of family experience that money couldn't purchase, but that had been made possible through the hard work of moral growth and relationship repair. But the most important measure of success was not the family's increased happiness, but Rosa's own sense of satisfaction and security in her work. She had found ways to provide excellent service while maintaining personal dignity, to care for others while protecting her own well-being, and to build relationships that honored her full humanity while respecting appropriate professional boundaries. As summer approached with its promise of continued growth and renewal, the Carrington family and Rosa had created together a model of employment relationship that demonstrated how wealth and privilege could be combined with justice and respect to create households that served everyone's needs while honoring everyone's dignity. The lessons learned through their difficult experience had transformed not only their individual characters, but also their understanding of how different people could work together in ways that reflected the best possibilities of American ideals about equality, opportunity, and mutual respect. Maybe you know someone like Rosa, someone who serves silently, who loves unseen, who bears the crushing weight of dignity amidst hardship. Maybe you are that person. Rose's story reminds us that true strength isn't measured by the size of our bank accounts or the grandeur of our homes, but by our ability to maintain grace under pressure, to forgive without bitterness, and to see the humanity in everyone we encounter. In a world that often rewards loudness over gentleness, aggression over compassion, and selfishness over service, Rose's quiet dignity stands as a testament to values that transcend economic circumstances and social position. Her willingness to return to a family that had betrayed her trust wasn't weakness. It was the strongest possible demonstration of character that sought transformation rather than revenge, healing rather than hatred. The Carrington family's journey from callous privilege to genuine respect illustrates that redemption is possible when people are willing to confront their failures honestly and work consistently to become worthy of the forgiveness they seek. But it also demonstrates that forgiveness, while powerful and healing, doesn't erase consequences or eliminate the need for changed behavior that proves good intentions through sustained action. Robert's transformation from a man who valued wealth above relationships to someone who understood that money without character created poverty of the soul shows us that it's never too late to examine our priorities and make different choices about what kind of people we want to become. His children's growth from entitled teenagers to young adults, conscious of their responsibilities to others, proves that even privilege can be transformed into compassion when guided by proper examples and moral courage. But perhaps the most important lesson from this story is about the invisible army of women like Rosa who keep our society functioning through their dedication, competence, and care. In homes across America, domestic workers, caregivers, cleaners, and cooks provide essential services that enable others to pursue careers and opportunities that would be impossible without their support. Yet too often, their contributions are taken for granted, their dignity is compromised by thoughtless treatment, and their economic security remains vulnerable to the whims of employers who hold disproportionate power over their lives. Rose's story reminds us that these women deserve more than our casual gratitude. They deserve our respect, our appreciation, and our commitment to creating employment relationships that honor their full humanity while providing the security and dignity that all work should offer. They deserve written contracts that protect their rights, fair wages that reflect their value, and treatment that recognizes their essential contributions to the families and communities they serve. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you ever been the invisible presence that held someone else's life together while struggling to manage your own challenges? Have you ever found the courage to forgive someone who had the power to hurt you, choosing grace over bitterness even when bitterness would have been justified? Tell me your story in the comments. Share your experiences with finding dignity in difficult circumstances, with practicing forgiveness when it seemed impossible, or with learning to see the full humanity of those whose service we too often take for granted. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it can reach another woman who needs hope today, who needs to be reminded that her work matters, that her dignity is valuable, and that her quiet strength is changing the world in ways that may never make headlines, but that touch individual lives with healing and transformation. For more heartfelt stories like this one, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional road with us, for opening your hearts to Rose's journey, and for joining us in celebrating the quiet heroes who serve others with love, who maintain grace under pressure, and who prove every day that the most important currency isn't money, but character. We'll see you in our next story, where we'll continue exploring the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the power of compassion to transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for growth, healing, and hope.